Hi, in this video we will look into the difference between gauge pressure and vacuum pressure. Okay, so um, if a system pressure is greater than the atmosphere pressure, then the term gauge pressure is used. For example, let's illustrate. This is the gauge pressure. We're gonna call this is going to be our atmosphere pressure. So this is 1 atmosphere pressure. If it's 1 atmosphere pressure, we know that's the pressure right here. If it's in PSI, pound per square inch, 1 atmosphere pressure is 14.696 PSI. Okay. Then, if you have a system now, and their pressure is going to be greater than this atmosphere pressure. It's somewhere here, and this point is going to be the absolute pressure of the system, right? The system right here, absolute pressure of the system. And the gauge pressure is defined as it's going to be how much more above this atmosphere pressure. That's going to be your gauge pressure. So it's a reference to the atmosphere pressure. Then that's our equation. P gauge, this P gauge right here, it's this absolute pressure of this entire system right here minus the 1 atmosphere pressure, which is 14.696 psi. Or it's 101,325 Pascal, right? So that's when gauge pressure is used. So if you have a system that have a higher pressure than 14.696, then you can figure out the gauge pressure. It's how much more above the atmosphere pressure. On the contrary, if you have a system, the pressure is really low. So if I'm going to draw something like from here now, if my pressure here is actually lower than this atmosphere pressure, and then this is going to be the absolute pressure now for this lower pressure, right? And vacuum pressure is defined as how much below this atmosphere pressure. That's going to be the difference, the gap between them. That's going to be called P vacuum. So in other words, our P vacuum is going to be this equation right here. It's going to be using your atmosphere pressure, which is 14.696, minus the absolute pressure of your system, which is low. That's why you're using vacuum pressure to describe it. It's how much lower than our atmosphere pressure. That's your vacuum pressure. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some idea about gauge and vacuum. Now let's bring up to the reality. You know, when you put your air in your tire, and normally often the tire is 35 psi. So that's 35 psi. And have we wondered, is that the gauge pressure? Is that absolute pressure or vacuum pressure? Of course not vacuum pressure, because the air inside the tire is high pressure. So it's going to be way above 1 atmosphere pressure anyway. So here, let's clarify that 35 psi you put it in there is actually gauge pressure, because when you use your pressure gauge to measure, that little gadget you are using to measure this pressure is calibrated with your atmosphere pressure. So that pressure you measured is how much above, which means 35 psi above this atmosphere pressure. So if you're gonna asking to find out what's actually the pressure inside, which is your absolute pressure inside the tire, is going to be using this equation, right? P absolute pressure is going to be the gauge pressure plus this atmosphere pressure. Because the gauge pressure is 35, that's 35 above the 14.696. So the true pressure or the absolute pressure inside is actually 49.696 psi inside the tire. Okay, so that's one example of absolute versus gauge versus vacuum pressure. All right, I'll see you on the next time. Bye.